100 years ago, Parliament passed a groundbreaking piece of legislation, the Ancient Monuments Act, which for the first time allowed the government to intervene to protect historic monuments threatened with destruction. In the centuries since, the state has built up an impressive collection of more than 800 historic houses, ruins and monuments, of which the most famous is probably Stonehenge. To begin with, they were the responsibility of an Ancient Monuments Board, part of an obscure government department called the Office of Works. Later, that became the Ministry of Public Building and Works, and in 1982 handed over to English Heritage, Historic Scotland and Cadw in Wales. Now, Simon Thurley, English Heritage's chief executive, has written The Men from the Ministry, which tells that story. Sounds a rather dry tome. In fact, it's a fascinating story of how attitudes to heritage have changed over the past century and more. Simon Thurley, you've written this book in recognition of the centenary of the Ancient Monuments Act of 1913, but that was not achieved without a struggle, particularly opposition from people who thought it was an affront to private property.
Well, in a sense, I think it probably was an affront to private property, because for all time previously, an owner could have done precisely what he wanted to his own house. And in 1913, an Act of Parliament is passed that restricts the private property rights of individuals. And of course, Parliament is made up by landowners, by property owners. So this was Turkey's voting for Christmas. And it is surprising in some ways that it got through at all.
What were the arguments then? What persuaded them?
I think what persuaded them was an individual case. It was the case of Tattershall Castle, a 15th century brick tower in Lincolnshire, which was going to be dismantled. The fireplaces, which were quite famous, had been yanked out, were crated up, were going to be sold to America. And it was felt that this was really a scandal. And I think it genuinely moved people in Parliament.
The Office of Works, as it then was, Department of Ancient Monuments, came up with a very traditional, we would say, a rather old-fashioned definition of heritage, and it involved archaeological remains, abbeys and castles. Why did they not spread the net a little wider?
I think they did have quite a, by our standards, a narrow view of what was significant. And their brief was to collect and to save the most important monuments in the nation's history. And they saw the two defining moments as being the Reformation, the moment when Britain became a Protestant nation, and the Civil War, the moment where we became a parliamentary democracy. And they were represented by the abbeys, dissolved by Henry VIII, and the castles slighted in the Civil War. And so these two categories of monuments represented the national story, and that's what they wanted to collect.
Now, one of the things that comes across powerfully from the book is how quickly this newly formed department in the Office of Works gained confidence, grew in size, and you would argue effectively pioneered the modern heritage industry.
Yeah, I think they invented it, really. I mean, in 1913, they were responsible for a few royal palaces and a couple of old castles. By 1939, they had literally hundreds of monuments that were open to the public, and that process of opening them forced them to invent all the things we're familiar with today. So the ticket office, the sort of site museum, the guidebooks, the postcards, the sort of interpretation panels, the signs on the sites. It was all invented by about sort of 1935.
And they were pushing with the grain of society because there was at the time a growing interest in history and heritage, to some extent sort of politically motivated, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think there was a very strong view at the time that Englishness, that the whole self-awareness of where we came from was a vital piece of glue in a society that was very fractured. After the First World War, and terrible economic problems, of course you've got in the 1930s, the Depression. And one of the things that was to hold a nation together was a sense of common history and inheritance.
And the motor car played an important part.
The motor car is totally fundamental because, of course, these places were all miles from anywhere. And until the char-a-bang, the sort of early type of bus, and the motor car was invented, you couldn't get very easily to Stonehenge or to remote castles up in Northumberland.
The motor car was fundamental, and so too was the motor mower.
The view was that the monuments were like documents, and they could be read by the public as a document could be read. But to do that, you had to tidy them up. You had to take the ivy off, you had to lay the ruins out, you had to set them in beautifully mown grass, which was only possible from the post-First World War years, because small enough mowers to dodge between the ruins were invented.
One of the things that comes across strongly from the book is, certainly in the middle of the last century, the rivalry between English heritage and the National Trust. On some occasions, Audley End, for instance, there was active competition between the two organisations to see who would take it over.
Yeah, we have to remember that up until the Second World War, the National Trust was a very small organisation. It owned very few buildings, it owned quite a lot of land, but it was a very small body. The Office of Works was a massive, machine. It was receiving tens of millions of visitors to its sites and its visitor centres and its guidebooks and everything. But after the Second World War, there did come this terrible problem about how the country houses were going to be saved. And of course, the men from the ministry naturally expected, well, we've saved the castles, we've saved the ancient monuments, we've saved the abbeys, now we save the country houses. But the Treasury said, no, not in your Nelly, this is going to be too expensive.
But there were exceptions, and Audley End was one. Why? Why did Audley End go to the Office of Works, or the Ministry of Works, not to the National Trust?
If you like, Audley End was the test case, the tussle, which the Ministry of Works actually won. But it was also the tussle that frightened the Treasury. The National Trust's formula of having an endowment, something you could never organise in government, of course, because the government would just take the money from the endowment and spend it, was a brilliant solution. And it actually allowed the country houses to be saved with a pot of money dedicated to their maintenance and upkeep.
This book stops in the early 80s, 1982, with the creation of English Heritage and Historic Scotland and Cadw, and a few years later the Historic Royal Palaces, all agencies of government. How sustainable is the present arrangement in the long term? Because at the end of the book you suggest, for one thing, that we've got our priorities wrong. We spend far too much, for instance, on old master paintings and not nearly enough on this splendid national collection of historic buildings.
Well, of course, buildings are inherently quite expensive to maintain, and particularly ruins, because a ruin was never designed to be frozen in a ruined state. It was designed to have a roof on, and it was designed to stand up. So it's a very expensive thing to do. And whilst quite a lot of the costs of doing that are defrayed by membership and visitors coming, it still requires quite a substantial chunk of money from the government. And I think it has been seen, particularly in the new Labour years, that paintings, potentially sharks in tanks of formaldehyde, were culturally more significant than medieval abbeys in Yorkshire. And at the end of the book, I do make a contention that the cultural value of this great collection of ancient monuments is at least equal to a painting on a piece of canvas painted by a man in the 16th century in Italy who has no particular relationship to what happened in this little country.
Simon Thurley, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.